Emily sat on the window seat, knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes following the raindrops as they raced each other down the glass. The world outside was quiet, but the silence inside her was louder. She hadn't spoken a word in years. Not to her father, not to the staff, not to anyone. People stopped asking why a long time ago. They whispered their theories in the hallways, thinking she couldn't hear, but she always could. She just didn't answer. Her father had tried everything: expensive doctors, speech therapists, even foreign specialists who promised miracles. None of it worked. Finally, he decided she needed someone at home, someone who could keep her company and watch over her when he was away on business. That's when Ruth arrived. She wasn't like the other nannies. She was younger, dressed simply, and had a warm, steady gaze that made you feel like she saw through all the walls you built. And unlike the others, she brought her daughter with her. Mia was about Emily's age, but smaller, with big, curious eyes and a constant smile. She talked a lot about her school, her toys, her cat back at home, and she didn't seem bothered that Emily never replied. On their first day together, Mia followed Emily from room to room like a shadow. Emily tried to ignore her, burying herself in a book, but Mia sat right next to her on the couch, swinging her legs and humming under her breath. Ruth didn't push. She never asked Emily to speak. Instead, she worked quietly in the background, folding laundry, preparing snacks, tidying the already spotless house. Sometimes Emily caught her watching, not with pity like the others, but with patience, as if she believed Emily would talk when she was ready. One evening, Ruth made hot cocoa for both girls and placed the steaming mugs on the table. Mia drank hers immediately, but Emily just held the cup between her hands, letting the warmth sink into her skin. Ruth didn't comment. She just sat across from them, sipping her own cocoa, the silence broken only by Mia's cheerful chatter. But Emily stayed guarded. She kept her bedroom door locked whenever she could. Inside, her room was her world, walls lined with books, sketch pads stacked neatly on the desk, and a small wooden box hidden under her bed. That box was her most precious possession, and no one was allowed to touch it. The only time she looked truly alive was when she was sketching. Her drawings were detailed, full of shadows and figures that told stories she would never speak. Ruth noticed the drawings one afternoon when she came in to change the bed sheets. A half-finished page lay on the desk, showing two figures standing in the rain, one tall, one small, both looking over their shoulders at something in the dark. Ruth's hand hesitated above the paper, but before she could look closer, Emily appeared in the doorway, eyes sharp, snatching the paper and shoving it into a folder. She didn't say a word, but her expression was clear. Stay out. Mia wasn't so careful. She wandered freely, curious about everything. One day, when Emily was reading by the window, Mia crept into her room and peeked under the bed. Her small fingers brushed against the wooden box, pulling it halfway into the light before Emily's shadow fell over her. Emily grabbed the box, holding it close to her chest, her eyes flashing a warning. Mia stepped back quickly, murmuring, "Sorry," before running out. Emily slid the box back under the bed and sat there for a long time, listening to the faint sound of Ruth's voice downstairs. The days passed in this quiet rhythm. Ruth tried gentle ways to connect, leaving fresh flowers on Emily's desk, making her favorite meals, letting Mia invite her to play board games, but Emily stayed in her shell. Sometimes she thought about speaking, just one word, but every time she opened her mouth, her throat tightened, and the memory of that night years ago came flooding back. It was easier to stay silent. One night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The soft hum of voices drifted up from downstairs, Ruth and Mia laughing together over something silly. The sound was warm, safe, and for a moment, Emily let herself imagine what it would feel like to join them. To sit at the table, laugh at Mia's stories, and not have the heavy weight of silence pressing down on her chest. But then the thought of her father's sharp eyes returned, and she rolled over, pulling the blanket over her head. Ruth began to notice the small things: how Emily's shoulders relaxed when Mia was near, how her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking. She didn't mention it, but she adjusted her approach, leaving the two girls together more often while she worked nearby. Sometimes she'd catch Emily watching Mia's hands as she built puzzles or braided string into bracelets, her lips twitching as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite manage it. The weather turned colder and the days grew shorter. The house, large and echoing, felt even quieter. Ruth often found herself wondering what it would take to break through the wall Emily had built. She didn't want to force it. She wanted Emily to know someone was there, not to heal her with questions, but to give her a reason to speak when she was ready. Emily, on the other hand, found herself torn. Part of her wanted Ruth and Mia to leave her alone. Another part, one she tried to bury, wanted to hold on to their presence a little longer. The warmth of Mia's laugh, the kindness in Ruth's eyes, it stirred something she thought had long since frozen. But with that warmth came danger, because speaking meant opening the door to truths she had kept locked away for years. And some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. Ruth started to see things most people would overlook. Emily moved around the house like a shadow, quiet and deliberate, as if she was afraid someone would hear her even when no one was looking. She had a way of disappearing into corners. Sitting so still, it almost felt like she wasn't there at all. But her eyes were always awake, watching everything. Ruth could feel them sometimes, sharp and searching, as if Emily was studying her every move. Mia didn't notice these small things. She was too busy exploring. Every room in the millionaire's mansion was a new adventure for her. Grand hallways, dusty attics, polished dining rooms that looked like they were waiting for guests who never came. Sometimes she dragged Emily along, grabbing her hand without asking, pulling her into sunlit rooms and whispering about secret hideouts behind the curtains. Emily never smiled, but she didn't pull away either. One afternoon, while Ruth was folding laundry in the upstairs hall, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Mia slipping into Emily's room. Ruth didn't stop her, curious to see what would happen. Inside, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed with a sketch pad on her lap. She was drawing something in long, dark strokes. Mia climbed up beside her, peering over her shoulder. "What is it?" she asked. Emily didn't look up. The pencil kept moving, like lines shaping into a narrow alley with rain falling between tall buildings. In the corner of the page was a small figure holding a box. Mia frowned. "Is that you?" she whispered. Emily's hands froze for a second before she turned the page sharply, hiding the drawing with a new blank sheet. Later, when Ruth came in to put away laundry, she saw a folder lying half open on the desk. Inside were dozens of sketches. Some were simple landscapes, but most were unsettling. Faces half hidden in shadow, windows with figures peeking out, and people running through the rain. None of them were happy pictures. She was about to lift one out when Emily appeared in the doorway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried a warning. Ruth closed the folder without a word and left the room. The next day, Ruth found Mia sitting at the kitchen table, chewing on her pencil and looking guilty. "What happened?" Ruth asked. Mia shrugged but avoided her gaze. "Emily doesn't like me looking under her bed," she said finally. Ruth paused. "You looked under her bed?" Mia nodded slowly. "There's a wooden box there. She grabbed it really fast and told me with her eyes to get out." Ruth didn't scold her. Instead, she made a mental note. Whatever was in that box mattered deeply to Emily. In the days that followed, Ruth noticed more odd patterns. Emily avoided her father completely. If she heard him coming down the hallway, she would vanish into another room or slip out into the garden until he was gone. When they were in the same space, Emily kept her head down, never meeting his eyes. He didn't seem to mind. In fact, he barely acknowledged her at all, speaking to her like she was a piece of furniture. It unsettled Ruth, but she stayed quiet, unsure of the history between them. One late afternoon, Ruth came upstairs to check on the girls and found the door to Emily's room ajar. She peeked inside. Emily was sitting on the floor with Mia, arranging small objects in a straight line: buttons, marbles, a key, and a folded photograph. Ruth's gaze lingered on the photograph, but before she could see the image, Emily snatched it up and tucked it into her pocket. She picked up the rest of the items and dropped them into the wooden box. The click of the lock was sharp in the quiet room. That night, while Ruth was reading in the living room, Mia sat beside her and whispered, "I think Emily wants to talk." Ruth looked at her in surprise. "What makes you say that?" Mia leaned closer. "Sometimes she moves her lips when she's looking at me, like she's saying something but no sound comes out." Ruth thought about this long after Mia had gone to bed. If Emily was trying to speak, then something or someone was stopping her from doing it. The mansion itself began to feel heavier to Ruth. The high ceilings and long corridors were beautiful, but there was a stillness in the air, like the house was holding its breath. Staff members kept to themselves, their footsteps always soft, their voices low. They didn't make conversation with Emily, only nodding politely if they passed her. No one asked her questions. It was as though everyone had silently agreed not to disturb her. One evening, Ruth passed by Emily's room and saw a faint light under the door. She knocked gently, and when there was no answer, opened it a crack. Emily was sitting at her desk, her head bent over the sketch pad. She was drawing fast, her hand moving in quick, urgent strokes. Ruth stepped closer and saw the image, two small figures in a bedroom, one standing by the door, the other sitting on the floor holding a box. The door in the picture had a shadow behind it, long and dark. Emily noticed her and slammed the pad shut, breathing hard. Ruth stepped back, murmuring, "Good night." But her mind was restless. Whatever Emily was holding back, it wasn't small. The locked box, the secret drawings, the way she avoided her father, it all felt connected. She wondered if Mia had unknowingly stepped into something far more complicated than either of them understood. The next morning, Emily didn't come down for breakfast. When Ruth went upstairs, she found her curled up in bed, the box clutched in her arms like a shield. Her eyes were open, but she didn't look at Ruth. She just tightened her grip, as if daring anyone to take it from her. Ruth stood there for a long moment, wanting to ask what was inside, but knowing the question would only make her retreat further. The sense of mystery grew stronger each day. Emily wasn't just silent. She was guarding something. And Ruth could feel that whatever it was the reason the girl had locked herself away from the world. Mia, with her innocence, had gotten closer to Emily in weeks than most had in years. But getting closer also meant getting nearer to the truth Emily was hiding. A truth that Ruth suspected might not be safe to uncover. The rain came without warning, turning the sky dark in the middle of the afternoon. Thick clouds rolled over the mansion, and the wind howled through the tall trees in the garden. Ruth was in the kitchen preparing sandwiches when the first clap of thunder rattled the windows. Mia came running in, laughing at the noise, but Emily wasn't with her. Ruth wiped her hands and asked where Emily was. Mia shrugged. "Upstairs, I think," she said, already pulling out a chair to sit. The storm grew worse within minutes. Rain slammed against the glass and lightning lit up the sky. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The house fell into darkness, except for the faint gray light from the windows. Ruth took a deep breath and told Mia to stay put while she found some candles. She moved quickly, feeling her way to the cupboard, her mind already thinking about how Emily would react to the sudden blackout. When Ruth returned to the kitchen with 2 lit candles, Mia was gone. The chair was empty, and the sound of soft footsteps came from the hallway. She followed them quietly, turning the corner toward the stairs. Halfway up, she heard faint voices. No, not voices, but one voice, a whisper. She froze, straining to listen. It was coming from the kitchen doorway, but when she turned her head, the sound shifted, pulling her toward the other end of the hallway. Ruth walked carefully toward the dining room. Lightning flashed through the windows, and in that brief light, she saw Emily standing in the middle of the room, close to Mia. Emily's head was bent forward, her lips moving. Mia stood very still, her wide eyes locked on Emily's face, as if she was hearing something important. Ruth's heart skipped. Emily was speaking. Actually speaking. But the words were too soft, too quick for Ruth to catch. She didn't want to scare her, so she stayed at the edge of the doorway, hoping Emily would keep talking. But Mia noticed her first. The moment Ruth's shadow crossed the floor, Emily stopped. Her mouth closed, her eyes went blank, and she stepped back like someone had caught her doing something wrong. Mia looked from one to the other, confused. The tension in the room was heavy, almost visible. "Are you okay?" Ruth asked gently, taking a step closer. Emily didn't move or answer. She glanced once at Mia, then turned away, walking out of the room without a sound. Ruth let her go, sensing that pushing her now would only make her retreat further. Mia turned to Ruth and whispered, "She said something." Her voice was almost trembling. "I think she was telling me something about a box." Ruth's eyes sharpened at the mention. She crouched down to meet Mia's gaze. "What exactly did she say?" Mia shook her head. It was so quiet, I only heard the word keep, but she was looking at me like it was important. Before Ruth could ask more, another clap of thunder shook the house, and Mia flinched. They spent the rest of the evening in the kitchen, eating sandwiches by candlelight. Emily never came back downstairs. Ruth checked on her once and found her lying in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The wooden box was beside her pillow, her arm draped protectively over it. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment, this time wondering what could be inside that made her hold on to it so tightly. Later that night, when the storm had calmed and the lights finally returned, Ruth lay awake in her own room, replaying the image in her mind. Emily's lips moving, the strange urgency in her posture, Mia's frozen attention. If Emily was finally ready to speak, why would she do it only to Mia and not to anyone else? And why in the middle of a blackout when the house felt more like a cage than a home? The next morning, Emily acted as if nothing had happened. She came down for breakfast, her expression blank, her movements quiet. Mia tried to sit beside her, but Emily kept her distance, sitting across the table instead. Ruth noticed Mia's puzzled frown, but said nothing. She didn't want to break whatever fragile trust had been forming between the two girls. As the day went on, Ruth kept catching Emily watching Mia. It wasn't the shy glances of someone making a friend. It was something deeper, almost protective, as if Emily was guarding her. When Mia laughed or talked about her school friends, Emily's gaze softened, but when anyone else entered the room, her shoulders stiffened and her eyes darted to the nearest exit. In the afternoon, while Ruth was cleaning the study, she overheard Mia humming in the hallway. The sound was soon joined by the faint shuffle of feet. Emily's. Ruth stayed hidden, peeking through the crack of the door. Mia was holding a small plastic horse in her hand, showing it to Emily, who actually leaned in to look. Ruth waited for another whisper, another sign of the voice she'd heard during the storm, but Emily stayed silent this time. That night, Mia told Ruth quietly, "I think she wants to tell me a secret." When Ruth asked why, Mia replied, "Because she looks at me like she's waiting for the right time, like she's scared someone will hear." Ruth's stomach tightened. That someone could only mean a few people in the house, and one of them was Emily's father. The stormy night replayed in Ruth's mind again and again. The whisper, the word keep, the guarded look in Emily's eyes. It wasn't just about speaking, it was about trusting. Emily hadn't spoken for years, but she had chosen that moment to try. Ruth didn't know what the secret was, but she knew it was something Emily had been carrying alone for a long time. And whatever it was, the storm had brought it dangerously close to the surface. The morning was cool and quiet, the kind of day where the air felt fresh after a night of rain. Ruth arrived earlier than usual, letting herself in with the spare key. She expected to find the house still sleepy, but as she walked through the garden toward the side entrance, she heard something soft. It wasn't the sound of the wind or birds. It was a low, sweet humming drifting through the air like a secret. She slowed her steps, following the sound until she reached the edge of the tall hedge that separated the garden from the back lawn. Peeking through the leaves, she froze. Emily was there, sitting on the grass with Mia. The two girls faced each other, and Emily's lips were moving. It wasn't speech, at least not in the way most people talked, but there was a rhythm to it. Her mouth formed shapes, and a faint melody escaped. It was gentle and shaky, like someone trying to remember a song from long ago. Mia sat completely still, as if she didn't want to miss a single note. Ruth held her breath, afraid that any sound would scare Emily into silence. Emily's hair hung loose around her face, and for once, she didn't look tense. Her shoulders were relaxed, her eyes focused softly on Mia. The sight made Ruth's chest ache. She had never seen Emily like this before, open, unguarded, almost alive. It was as if the girl she had been hiding all these years had stepped into the sunlight for a few precious moments. The humming faded, and Emily picked up a small flower from the grass, handing it to Mia without a word. Mia smiled and tucked it behind her ear. Then Emily did something that startled Ruth even more. She laughed. It was soundless, just a quick lift of her shoulders and a spark in her eyes, but it was laughter all the same. Ruth's fingers tightened on the hedge. She wanted to step forward to tell Emily she had heard her, to let her know she wasn't alone in this, but she stayed hidden. If Emily knew someone was watching, she might close herself off again. A cloud passed over the sun, and the moment shifted. Emily glanced toward the house, her face tightening. She got to her feet, brushing grass from her dress. Mia started to say something, but Emily shook her head and motioned toward the side path that led to her room. Without speaking, they both walked back inside. Ruth stayed in the garden for a moment longer, letting the scene settle in her mind. She had just seen proof that Emily's silence wasn't unbreakable. It was a choice, or maybe a shield. When Ruth went inside a few minutes later, the house felt different, as if the warmth from the garden had been left behind. Emily was at the dining table, quietly reading a book, her face a blank mask again. Mia was in the kitchen, pouring juice, her earlier smile still lingering. Ruth joined her, lowering her voice. "You were outside with Emily?" Mia nodded, sipping her drink. "She was singing a little bit," she said casually, but her eyes sparkled. "Like a song, but not really. Just humming." Ruth's pulse quickened. "Did she say anything?" Mia shook her head. "Not words, but she was happy. I think she wanted me to be happy too." For the rest of the morning, Ruth kept glancing at Emily, wondering what had triggered that moment in the garden. Was it the fresh air? The safety of being with Mia? Or had Emily simply felt safe enough to let her guard down, knowing no one else was around? Whatever the reason, Ruth knew she had to be careful. Too much attention might push Emily back into her silence completely. In the afternoon, Mia asked if they could go outside again. Ruth agreed, but this time she stayed at a distance, pretending to water the plants while watching them from the corner of her eye. Emily didn't hum this time. She picked flowers, arranged them in patterns on the grass, and let Mia chatter without interruption. Every so often she looked toward the house, her eyes flicking to the upper windows, and Ruth noticed the tension in her posture when she did. It was as if she was checking to make sure no one was watching from inside. When they came back in, Emily went straight to her room, the door clicking shut behind her. Mia lingered in the hall, holding a small bunch of flowers. She looked up at Ruth and said, "I think she wants to tell me something soon." Ruth felt a mix of hope and unease. "Why do you think that?" Mia shrugged. "Because she looks at me like she's waiting for the right moment, like if she talks, it has to be just us, with no one else around." Ruth's stomach tightened. That meant whatever Emily wanted to say wasn't safe for everyone to hear. That evening, while setting the table for dinner, Ruth heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned to see Emily, standing in the doorway. She held out a small folded piece of paper. Ruth reached for it, but Emily shook her head and stepped past her, placing it in Mia's hands instead. Then, without waiting for a reaction, she walked away. Mia unfolded the paper slowly. Inside was a simple pencil drawing, two girls sitting in the grass, one handing a flower to the other. Above them, in small, shaky handwriting, were the words, "Safe here." Ruth stared at the paper, her chest tightening. It wasn't much, but it was more than Emily had shared with anyone in years. Mia smiled softly, as if she understood. She slipped the paper into her pocket, and neither of them mentioned it to anyone else. But Ruth couldn't stop thinking about it. The garden wasn't just a place where Emily hummed a song. It was the only place she felt free enough to show a piece of herself. That night, long after Mia had gone to bed, Ruth stood by the window looking out at the dark garden. The image of Emily humming in the sunlight replayed in her mind, along with the small, careful handwriting, "Safe here." She wondered how many places in this world Emily felt safe in, and what it would take for her to feel that way everywhere. And she wondered, too, who had made her feel unsafe in the first place. A sudden crash shattered the quiet of the afternoon. Ruth, who had been in the hallway folding a blanket, froze for a split second before hurrying toward the sound. It had come from upstairs, Emily's room. Her footsteps quickened, the creak of the wooden stairs almost drowned out by the rapid beating of her heart. She reached the doorway and stopped. Emily was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. A picture frame lay broken beside her, its edges glittering dangerously in the sunlight from the window. Her hands were trembling as she clutched something to her chest. Ruth's eyes dropped to the object and immediately recognized it, the small wooden box Emily guarded so fiercely. Emily didn't look up. Her hair hung forward like a curtain, hiding her face, but her shoulders were tense. The way she held that box was different now, tighter, almost desperate. Ruth took a cautious step into the room. Are you hurt? She asked softly, scanning for cuts on her hands. Emily didn't answer. She moved slightly, turning her body away so the box was shielded from view, as if Ruth might try to take it from her. Ruth's gaze shifted to the floor where the glass had fallen. In the middle of the shards, there was a photograph, slightly bent from the fall, but still clear enough to see. It showed a much younger Emily, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing beside a woman Ruth had never seen before. The woman had dark hair tied back in a braid and an arm wrapped protectively around the little girl. There was something in her eyes, softness mixed with worry. Ruth bent down slowly, careful not to cut herself, and picked up the photo. "Is this your mother?" she asked gently. Emily's head shot up, her eyes wide, and for a moment Ruth thought she might speak. But instead, Emily snatched the photograph from her hand so quickly it was like a flash of movement. She tucked it inside the wooden box, slammed the lid shut, and twisted the small key in the lock. The metallic click echoed in the room. Without another word, Emily stood and carried the box to her bed, placing it carefully in the center as if setting down something fragile. She sat beside it, her fingers still gripping the lid. Ruth could see the way her knuckles had gone pale from holding on so tightly. Ruth wanted to ask about the woman in the picture, but she could feel the wall rising between them again. She knew if she pushed too hard, Emily would retreat completely. So instead, she began picking up the glass, her movements slow and quiet. "I'll get this cleaned up so you don't cut yourself," she said, keeping her tone light. Emily didn't respond, but she didn't stop Ruth either. As Ruth worked, she kept thinking about the expression on that woman's face. It wasn't the kind of smile you put on for a camera. It was guarded, as though she'd been caught in a moment she wasn't sure she should be in. And the way Emily had reacted, that photograph meant something. Maybe it explained the silence. Maybe it explained the fear in her eyes when her father was around. When the last shard was gone, Ruth stood and glanced at Emily, who was still sitting on the bed with the box beside her. "If you need help with anything, you can tell me," Ruth said softly. Emily's eyes flicked toward her just for a second, then dropped again. Ruth left the room, but the image of that photo stayed in her mind. Later that day, Mia came skipping into the kitchen where Ruth was preparing tea. She leaned close and whispered, "Emily's been looking at pictures." Ruth paused. "What kind of pictures?" Mia shrugged. "A lady. I think it's her mom. She put it away really fast when I came in." Ruth felt a prickle of unease. If that woman was Emily's mother, why had she never been mentioned? And why was her picture hidden inside a locked box instead of in a frame like the ones of her father in the hall? The more she thought about it, the more it felt like this wasn't just a memory Emily was holding on to. It was a secret. That evening, Ruth decided to bring it up again, but carefully. She found Emily in the living room, sitting by the window with her sketch pad. "Your drawing earlier looked like someone I saw in that photo," Ruth said in a low voice. Emily froze, the pencil hovering above the page. "She seemed important to you." Emily didn't look up. She closed the sketch pad slowly, slid it under the cushion, and stood. She left the room without a sound, her footsteps quick but quiet. Ruth sighed, realizing she'd pushed too far again. An hour later, Ruth passed by Emily's room and noticed the door slightly open. Inside, Emily was on her bed, the box open in front of her. The photo lay on top of the contents, and her fingers were tracing the woman's face in the picture. It was a tender, almost heartbreaking gesture, the way a child touches something they miss but can't have. Emily must have sensed Ruth's presence because she quickly shut the box again. This time, though, she didn't lock it immediately. She held the lid closed with her hands, staring at it for a long moment before finally reaching for the key. The click of the lock was softer this time, but final. Ruth walked away without being seen, her mind spinning. The shattered glass, the hidden photo, the way Emily clung to that box like her life depended on it. None of it was random. That woman was at the center of everything Emily was keeping inside. And until Ruth understood who she was and why she was hidden, she knew Emily's silence would remain unbroken. Ruth was in the living room, sorting through a small pile of laundry when she heard an unusual sound, a muffled thud followed by a faint cry. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her stand still. She knew it hadn't come from the kitchen or the hall. Her eyes darted toward the stairs. Mia had gone upstairs to play just a few minutes ago, and Emily had been in her room. Something didn't feel right. She set the clothes aside and walked quickly toward the sound. Halfway up the staircase, she heard it again, this time a short, shaky sob. Her heart began to pound. She reached the top and turned toward the bedrooms. The door to Emily's room was open, but not wide. Ruth pushed it gently, and what she saw made her chest tighten. Mia was standing near the wall, her small hands covering her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Emily was standing in front of her, breathing hard, her eyes wide and frightened. It looked almost as if she'd been caught in the middle of something she didn't want anyone to see. Ruth rushed in, kneeling beside Mia. "What happened?" she asked quickly, looking from one girl to the other. Mia dropped her hands, still crying softly. Before she could answer, Emily shook her head violently. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no sound came out. Her breathing grew faster and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Ruth turned to Mia again. "Did something fall? Did you get hurt?" Mia sniffled, glancing at Emily. She just, Mia stammered, then stopped. Ruth could tell she was unsure if she should continue. That was when Emily suddenly stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes glistening, and then, in a voice so small and trembling it almost broke Ruth's heart, Emily whispered, "Don't let him take her." Ruth froze. The words had been spoken so softly, but they carried a weight that filled the room. Mia's eyes widened, startled by the sound of Emily's voice. Ruth could barely process what she'd just heard. After years of silence, Emily had spoken, 6 small words, but enough to send a chill through her. "Emily," Ruth said gently, trying not to scare her. But Emily had already stepped back, hugging herself tightly. She shook her head again, as if to say she wouldn't repeat it. Ruth reached for her, but Emily moved toward the bed, her body curling inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Ruth knelt beside Mia and wiped her tears. "It's okay, sweetheart, you're safe," she said, though her own mind was racing. "Don't let him take her." The words repeated over and over in her head. Who was him? Why would Emily think someone might take Mia? When Mia had calmed a little, Ruth coaxed her into the hallway and led her to her own room. She gave her a glass of water and told her to rest. Then she went back to Emily's door and stood there, unsure if she should go in. She could hear faint rustling inside, the sound of something being moved. Pushing the door open, she saw Emily sitting on the bed with the wooden box in her lap. The key was still in the lock, but the box was closed. Emily glanced at Ruth, her eyes a mix of fear and defiance. Ruth kept her voice soft. "I'm not here to take it. I just want to understand." Emily's fingers tightened on the box, but she didn't reply. Ruth stepped closer, her hands open to show she meant no harm. "You spoke to me just now. You can trust me with whatever you were trying to say." Emily shook her head again, this time slower, almost sad. She lowered her gaze to the box and pulled it closer to her chest. Ruth could see her shoulders trembling. It wasn't the trembling of someone cold. It was the trembling of someone holding too much fear inside. Ruth decided not to push further. She sat down in the chair by the desk and stayed quiet. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, the kind of words that could change everything if they were ever said out loud. After a while, Emily looked up at her. There was something pleading in her eyes, but also a warning. Ruth understood. Emily wasn't ready to explain, not fully, but the fact that she'd spoken at all meant she was reaching out, even if only a little. When Ruth finally left the room, she found Mia waiting for her in the hall. The little girl hesitated before speaking. "She wasn't being mean," Mia said softly. "She looked scared, like someone was coming to get me." Ruth knelt to meet her eyes. "Did she tell you who?" Mia shook her head. "No, just those words." The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Emily stayed in her room, only coming out for dinner, where she avoided looking at anyone, especially Mia. Her father wasn't home that evening, at which Ruth was secretly grateful for. She didn't want him noticing the change in Emily. Not yet. Later, when Mia was asleep, Ruth sat in the dim light of the kitchen, thinking about those 6 words again. Don't let him take her. It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. Emily had been silent for years, so for her to break that silence meant the danger she felt was real and urgent. And if she thought Mia was in danger, then someone in this house or someone connected to it was the reason. Ruth knew she had to be careful now. She couldn't confront anyone without proof, but she also couldn't ignore what she'd heard. Emily had trusted her enough to speak, even if it was only for a moment. That trust was fragile, and if Ruth broke it, she might never get another chance to hear the rest of the truth. As she climbed the stairs to bed, she passed Emily's door and paused. Through the thin gap at the bottom, she saw a strip of light. Inside, Emily was probably still awake, clutching that box like a lifeline. Ruth stood there for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, then stepped away. She would wait. But not too long. Whatever Emily was afraid of was still out there, and it might already be closer than they realized. The rain had stopped the next morning, but the air inside the mansion felt heavier than the clouds outside. Ruth couldn't stop thinking about Emily's words from the day before. They echoed in her head over and over, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Don't let him take her. Those words didn't sound like a random fear. They sounded like a memory. Emily avoided everyone during breakfast. She sat with her head down, barely touching her food, her wooden box resting on her lap under the table. Mia tried to talk to her, but Emily didn't look up. Her father came in halfway through the meal, and Ruth noticed how Emily stiffened instantly. She froze in place, not even breathing until he sat down at the far end of the table. He didn't greet her. He didn't even glance at her. But his presence alone was enough to change her completely. Her shoulders tensed, and her eyes never rose from her plate. After breakfast, Ruth found her in the library, sitting on the window seat with her box beside her. Ruth sat in a nearby chair, pretending to read, but really she was waiting. She kept her tone light when she finally spoke. Emily, yesterday, you tried to tell me something. Emily's grip on the box tightened. Ruth leaned forward a little. You don't have to tell me everything at once, but I need to know why you're afraid for Mia. Emily's eyes darted to the door, then back to Ruth. For a moment, it looked like she might speak. Her lips parted slightly, and she took in a shaky breath. Then she reached for her sketch pad and began drawing instead. Her pencil moved quickly across the page, and when she was done, she tore it out and handed it to Ruth. It was a drawing of a small girl, Mia, standing in the garden, but behind her was a tall shadow, much larger than her. The shadow had no face, only a dark outline, but its hand was reaching toward Mia. Ruth's chest tightened. She looked at Emily, but Emily had already turned away, staring out the window as if she hadn't drawn anything at all. That afternoon, while Mia was taking a nap, Ruth went to Emily's room. She knocked softly, and when there was no answer, she pushed the door open. Emily was sitting on her bed, the box open in front of her. Inside, Ruth caught glimpses of folded papers, a bracelet, the photograph she had seen before, and something else, a small hair ribbon, worn and frayed. Emily quickly closed the lid, but this time she didn't lock it right away. Ruth sat down on the edge of the bed, speaking gently. Was that woman in the picture your mother? Emily's eyes flickered with something. Pain, maybe. She didn't answer, but her silence felt like confirmation. What happened to her? Ruth asked softly. Emily swallowed, her gaze dropping to the box. Her hands trembled slightly, and then, without looking up, she whispered, He made her leave. The words were quiet but sharp, cutting through Ruth like a blade. Who? Ruth asked, though she already had a sinking feeling she knew. Emily's lips pressed together. She shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Ruth didn't push. She placed her hand gently on Emily's arm. You don't have to say it, but I believe you. That small touch seemed to break something in Emily. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a slow, shaky breath. He wants her too, she whispered, so faint Ruth almost missed it. Ruth's stomach dropped. Mia? Emily nodded, finally meeting Ruth's eyes. There was so much fear in them it made Ruth's heart ache. Everything started to make sense. The way Emily followed Mia with her eyes, the warnings, the drawings of shadows. Emily had been through something when she was younger, something involving her father and her mother. Now she believed Mia was in the same kind of danger. Ruth stayed with her for a long time, listening to the silence between them. It wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was heavy, filled with things that still hadn't been said. She promised herself she would protect both girls, no matter what. Later that evening, Emily's father called for Ruth in his study. He was polite, as always, but there was a certain sharpness in his tone. He asked how Emily had been behaving, if she'd been speaking to anyone. Ruth kept her voice calm, careful not to reveal anything. She said Emily was quiet as usual, spending time in her room. He nodded slowly, studying her with eyes that felt like they could peel back her thoughts. Something in his stare made her skin prickle. When Ruth left the study, she found Emily waiting in the hallway. She stepped forward quickly and pressed something into Ruth's hand. It was another drawing, this one of a locked door with two figures standing behind it. Written at the bottom in small, shaky letters were the words, "Don't open it." Ruth didn't ask questions. She slipped the drawing into her pocket and put her arm lightly around Emily's shoulders, guiding her back toward her room. She didn't know exactly what the warning meant, but she knew it was serious. And now more than ever, she was certain Emily's silence wasn't because she couldn't speak. It was because she was holding back a truth that could destroy everything if the wrong person heard it. That night, as Ruth lay in bed, she kept seeing the fear in Emily's eyes and hearing the weight in her voice when she said, "He wants her too." She knew she couldn't wait much longer. Sooner or later, Emily's father, or whoever he truly was, would make a move. And when that happened, Ruth had to be ready to protect them both, even if it meant breaking every rule in this house. Emily's father looked at Sarah for a long time, his eyes thoughtful but serious. Then he walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and made a call. Emily stood beside Sarah, still feeling the shock of hearing her own voice after so many years. She was afraid her father might change his mind, but he spoke calmly to the person on the other end, asking for arrangements to be made to send food, clothes, and blankets to the community center every week. He explained that the supplies would be given in Sarah's care to distribute properly. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. She had been ready to lose her job and maybe her freedom, but instead, she was now being trusted with something important. When the call ended, Emily's father turned to Sarah. He told her that while stealing was wrong, he now understood why she had done it. He said she should have told him sooner, because he would have helped. Sarah lowered her head, her voice shaky, saying she didn't believe a man like him would understand a woman like her. She explained how the families in the community center had nothing, how some of them were sick, how children slept on the cold floor without blankets. She said she could not walk past them every day and do nothing, so she used what she could get her hands on, and even if it meant risking everything. Emily listened closely, her heart heavy but also warm, because she had seen those families with her own eyes and knew Sarah was telling the truth. Her father walked to Sarah and put a hand on her shoulder. He said from now on she wouldn't have to hide. She would be part of a proper program to help those people, funded by him, so they would have food and warm clothes through the winter. He told her that she and Mia were welcome to stay in their jobs and in the house. Sarah's voice broke when she said thank you. She promised to be honest from that day forward. Emily felt a strange comfort watching them. Something inside her felt safe, like a wall had finally fallen after years of being trapped. In the weeks that followed, the change was visible in the house. Every Monday, a delivery truck came to the mansion, loaded with supplies. Sarah would oversee the packing, and Emily's father would check the lists before everything went out. Emily started going with Sarah and Mia to the community center. At first, she stayed close to Sarah, watching as families lined up, children smiling when they received a warm coat or a bag of food. Some of the kids reminded her of herself, quiet, watching everything, unsure if they could trust anyone. She began to smile at them, and a few smiled back. Mia, who had always been friendly, introduced Emily to the other children, telling them not to be afraid because she's really nice, just quiet. Emily even found herself laughing one afternoon when a little boy ran up and offered her a drawing he had made. At home, things changed too. Emily spoke in short sentences at first, her voice soft and uncertain. She would answer when her father asked about her day or when Sarah offered her food. Mia made a game out of it, asking Emily small questions just to hear her talk. Over time, Emily's voice grew stronger, and her words came more easily. One night at dinner, she surprised her father by telling him about a story she had read. The look on his face was filled with pride and relief. He reached across the table, holding her hand for a moment without saying a word. Sarah treated Emily like her own daughter, guiding her gently, but never forcing her to speak. Mia became Emily's closest friend, someone who could make her smile with a simple look. They painted together, played games, and sometimes just sat outside watching the sky. The house no longer felt silent and cold. It felt alive. Emily's father, seeing his daughter's progress, began spending more time at home. He joined them on visits to the community center, shaking hands with people, listening to their stories. Emily noticed that he seemed different too, less stern, more open. Months later, Emily stood in the middle of the community center, holding a box of food, and realized she was talking to a woman she had just met. The woman was thanking her for helping, and Emily was telling her it was no problem. She didn't even think about the fact that she was speaking freely. The sound of her own voice no longer felt strange. It felt natural. Sarah watched from across the room, her eyes full of quiet pride. When Emily turned to look at her, they shared a smile that said more than words could. One evening, as they drove back from the community center, Emily looked out of the car window at the lights of the city. She thought about the first day she had seen Sarah and Mia with that little brown bag in the kitchen. Back then, she had been silent and distant, thinking the world had nothing left for her. Uh, but that moment had started a chain of events that gave her a voice again, not just in speaking, but in how she felt about life. She realized that Sarah had not only helped those families, but had also unknowingly saved her. Emily turned to Sarah in the front seat and said softly, "Thank you." Sarah glanced back, smiling warmly, and replied, "You saved me too." From that day forward, Emily was no longer just the millionaire's silent daughter. She was part of something bigger, a bridge between two worlds that once seemed too far apart. And every time she spoke, every time she helped, she remembered the day she broke her silence to protect someone who had only ever shown her kindness. It was a reminder that sometimes one act of courage could change many lives, and that the most powerful voices are often the ones we thought were lost forever.